if you couldn't help but hear the hymn there singing upstairs for the entrance, it's called Wachet auf, which means wake up. So it fits perfectly. But we're also preparing, they're preparing for Christmas during the Advent season, where the Buddhists prepare also. December 8th, this Sunday, is the traditional Feast of the Enlightenment of the Buddha. Now, 2 weeks ago at our last meeting, I spoke about the farthest reaches of consciousness and the movement towards no self. And I mentioned Bernadette Roberts, who approaches path to no self from a very specifically Christian point of view in a way that no other Christian author has, or very few in history. But of course, no self is a very basic notion in Buddhism, as she acknowledges. And the path there is similar. Now, chapter 5 in here, which we're going to go over in some detail, she says it's not a specific phase on the path, but it's an essential attitude. And she calls it an open mind. Now, it fits very well, as you'll see, with very basic Zen principles, and in fact some Zen koans, the one by Joshu, which I may have cited in recent months. Joshu's one of his most famous statements is, what is it all about? It's, don't pick and choose. In other words, don't have preferences or judgments, or attitudes or concepts or approaches. Just have a completely, open mind. Or, as they would say, Buddha mind. Or, as the koans also say, no mind. No mind because no specific mind. Completely open. Joshu explains in one of the koans, number 57 in the Blue Cliff Record, so a monk asks, what does he mean, no picking and choosing? And he says, I alone am holy in heaven and earth. Which sounds like a really odd response, because it sounds, like egotistical or something. But of course, I alone is not Joshu. It's the enlightened self in heaven and earth. So the whole cosmic attitude is dependent on not having any self. And the proof of that, or an indication of that, is that it echoes what the Buddha himself, in the first koan of the Denko Roku, is said to have exclaimed, as he was enlightened looking at the morning star, talk about coming of the light, the moment of his enlightenment. He says, I and the great earth and all beings have achieved the way. So the I there is not the same I that sat down the night before, the limited I. And the great earth and all beings, heaven and earth, in other words. So it's very similar, if not identical, to that. So somehow to have this completely open mind is the Buddha mind, is Christ consciousness, whatever you want to call it. Better not call it anything, in the sense that don't conceptualize it, just be it. Reminds me too of the koan, the 23rd in the Momonkan that I spoke about a few weeks ago. Remember the story of Huineng, the sixth Chinese patriarch, who had to run away from the monastery because he was not deemed by the other monks to be worthy of the succession. And this former general, who had become a monk in the monastery, all full of himself and his own judgments, precisely, ran after him, then had a conversion when he met him on the mountain, and asked for his guidance. And Huineng said, and this is the title of the koan, think neither good nor evil. In other words, stop judging. Not just don't judge me, but don't judge anybody or anything as the key. So don't cling. That's another translation of the don't pick and choose. It's don't cling, non-choice and non-attachment. That brings it even closer to, of course, the second noble truth, which is that, suffering and illusion are the functions of attachment. And not just attachment to things, but to ideas and to judgments. And that literally drives us crazy and certainly keeps us from enlightenment. So So you see its connection to basic truth and basic Buddhist values. But I'd like to go through what she says, in the chapter here, which she calls phase 5 in the path to know self, and she has some interesting remarks about this, what it's like, what the different facets are of this open mind, of this non-judging. And she says that at university, and if you've ever been to university or teach in a university, you know that it's very hard to get away from opinions and judgments and concepts. But she says, this kind of thing offers no challenge unless it's really a challenge to the way you already think, whereas most of the time, as she says, you're simply assimilating whatever information comes, whether from politics or theology or whatever, into your already established system of values and your mental network, your concepts, your conceptual framework, and you never grow. I mean, however accurate it is, it's not accurate because it's limited. It's not adequate to reality. It's not the vast, boundless mind that we were talking about a minute ago. So, she said, how do you get out of this system? So she didn't find any success until she was in a literature class where the professor said, get out of your own way of thinking and judging in order to understand the literary characters in the context of their own frame of reference and within the context of their own philosophy of life. So in other words, just as an exercise, try and enter into somebody else's life experience and framework, which the art, the literature should help you to do. And she said this was the real challenge that class had to offer. And she said she met a mountain of obstacles, an automatic habit of judgment that I had never even noticed before. I wondered if I could ever be able to step out of my structured mind. So this was a challenge to be reckoned with. So this open mind is a goal, an exercise that was continually insightful and enlightening, the path that I had been looking for. Now this is interesting. In some respects it means putting aside the content of personal consciousness. That's very well expressed and almost expressed in a Buddhist way. The contents of consciousness. Remember when I spoke last teisho, I spoke about the highest level, the 8th level of the Buddhist in the Buddhist consciousness scheme of things, which speaks about storehouse consciousness, almost beyond your individuality. It's just the storehouse that your consciousness has of stuff, So this is putting aside and emptying the content of personal consciousness. So no more storehouse, because there's nothing stored there, and nothing to store it in, ultimately. So there's another conjunction of ideas of what we're dealing with here. So she says this, putting aside the content of personal consciousness seems to be necessary preparation for eventually going beyond the personal or I consciousness altogether. Get rid of the storehouse, get rid of the stuff that's stored there, and in the end, the consciousness will go with it, which is what both Buddhism and Christianity, her approach to Christianity, are saying. So we get rid of our frame of reference according to which we judge, evaluate, choose, and act. It's unconscious and automatic, that can keep us locked into our framework. So the movement is a way of knowing others as they are in themselves, as she said, not as they are in ourselves, which is, of course, a totally self-centered way of knowing, an unconscious imposition upon others of our ideas and judgments. So not as they are in themselves, not as they are in ourselves. Reminds me of Richard Rohr's famous, statement that we don't see people don't see things as they are; they see things as they are. All right, that's exactly the same notion here. So we go beyond our own way of seeing, but in the long run, everyone's way of seeing, because it's not a way of seeing; it's seeing, pure and simple. And beyond all self, never mind contents of self, but to get beyond ourself first of all. So we get out of our personal frame of reference. And she was afraid that, all the truths that she believed in, about her religion particularly, might be challenged or even fall by the wayside. But as she goes on to discover, no, they're just reaffirmed on a deeper level, beyond the concept and in the experience. And the experience is what counts, as she points out. Separation between intellectual and experiential for the mystic, she says, is impossible, since the nature of the experience is the knowing, is the Buddha mind or the Christ consciousness. So she was reassured about that. But then when it comes to reading, on the reading list, for example, for her course, there was the immoralist, whatever that is, but you get the idea. It was a little frightening. So do I end up with no conscience or no moral standard at all? She asks. The solution I discovered was to see each case in its own context without imposing my own standards. Now, that's really important. For your own personal life, for your social life, for your political life even, we'll get back to that. But it doesn't mean giving up the standards whereby I judge my own actions, she proposes. It only means giving up the imposition of my standards on others, giving up the expectation that others see things my way and act on my set of principles. Now that's really important. She wondered a few things. Do I just exchange one coat for another if I try and enter somebody else's point of view? Is it just one point of view for another point of view? Or if I don't wear any coat, any point of view, do I become dull-witted, spineless, with no mind, a complete void? Well, I eventually saw, this is good, that the open mind is not a blank mind in the negative sense. It was a mind not stuck in its own subjective perspective, its own views and judgments that are inhibiting growth. It was a mind that could see other perspectives and other alternatives to thereby gain insight, understanding, and hopefully wisdom. Indeed, that's the way in the first step. Now, she made a couple of other discoveries. The major discovery was the realization of the impossibility of putting on other people's coats, of getting under their skin. Now, we have to be honest about this. That's why it's always, if a person says to someone who's suffering and they're talking to, I can't imagine what you're going through. That's always a lot safer than saying, I can just imagine what you're going through. Because you can't, and they'll remind you of that right away. So we're going to qualify that at the end of the talk here, but realize that there's no way of you're actually understanding from in their skin, really experiencing exactly what they're going through. But she saw that was irrelevant and unnecessary. Instead, I discovered the true key to the open mind was nothing more than the cessation of judgment itself. So as long as you have an open mind, indeed open heart, in the face of whatever or whomever, that's the key thing. Not whether you can try and get into the experience itself of another person. Because you have a cosmic approach. So the continuous expectation of how things should be according to our point of view is a failure to see things as they are, to see them as they exist outside of ourselves. And thereby ignores the reality of change and growth in others as well as in ourselves. So the only way we can grow and others can grow is if we stop imposing stuff and let it flow from a deeper context within them and in us. Call it cosmic compassion or complete, acceptance. She says that, if you see a lot of kids talking to each other, they're usually just spouting their own stuff. But if you see adults doing the same thing, it's not so cute, The greatest result of the open mind is a charity, compassion that knows no prejudice, is beyond the need of mere tolerance or self-sacrifice or patience. Beyond all that, better than all that. Beyond a non-committal silence, obviously. And certainly beyond any subtle feeling of self-enlightenment. All this is just ego. It needs to be exposed as such. So there's a mutual freedom for true relationship and communication. This is a good point, though. But to give this freedom to others, we must first be secure within ourselves. And that's why so many people are so quick to judge and react and be defensive, because they're not secure in themselves. Even if they believe what they think they believe what they believe, there's more to it than that. They're not existentially secure. And the purpose of the unit of life, in other words, of being connected to reality, is to give this security and give this necessary freedom. So if you really do experience this connection to the absolute connection to reality, well, then you're secure. You don't need concepts to ground it or to defend it, and much less do you need to impose them on others in order to defend it, because you're meeting them on the same deeper level in which you find your security. Hugely important. So we learn that way of seeing things, and eventually this I consciousness that goes with it, will disappear on the way to know self, and that self grows increasingly silent. We must go beyond the truth in ourself, which cannot be done if we have gone out of ourself. And it's a state that is, continues growing and enlightening. She points out that at the peak of this unitive state, St. John of the Cross, perhaps the greatest Christian mystic, best known, as she says too, there is no way. He writes that at the top of Mount Carmel. There is no way. Well, you couldn't get more Zen than that. I mean, there's the pathless path, the gateless gate. There's no way because everything is it, But she says, I would substitute for that the open mind as the way forward, as the unseen path through space, It's well said. It's the full flowering of virtue for further enlightenment in the mysterious ways of God and man and nature, expressed in a Christian way. The open mind, I believe, fulfills this. And then she concludes with a lovely image. She says that this is like the gradual blossoming of a flower in the sunlight. It cannot be known, this understanding and love, as long as the bud is closed upon itself, clinging to its own views. This opening up is a movement of growth into full maturity and beauty of soul, a movement that continues until the petals can expand no more and fall away. There's no self anymore, not even the beautiful flower. It expands and then, where is it? Gone. The full blossoming has no other end than to bring the self to an end. Once the petals have fallen, everything else disappears, and the self is no more. Lucky us. Except we're not there anymore to be lucky. And I would like to, there's a beautiful passage in the next section, that just blew me away this morning when I read it, and it readdresses this issue of getting into another person's experience. You can't get into their actual physical, emotional experience under their skin, as she said, but listen to this. As she goes forward, a beautiful experience which stems from the center, when you're living at the center, is the ability to contact the center of other things. So it's center to center. See, it's not on the more superficial level, which isn't possible, but it's center to center, which is even deeper. You might recall Thomas Merton saying in that famous mystical experience he had on 4th and Walnut that there's this brilliant diamond-like center of poverty and brilliance in every person, and that they all come together in the brilliance of like a billion suns coming together in one light. See, that's center to center, when they all come together like that. It's as if my center ran into the individual center of everything else. To contact the center of another person is the rare experience of knowing God, or whatever you want to call it, in another in such a way that there is no central difference between self and other. That's when Dogen says, we're every person everywhere in the world, we are the other. That's where and how. What does it feel like? We'll find out. Listen to this. To contact the center of an animal is to contact love. Anyone with a pet knows that. Indeed, to contact the center of anything is the experience of love, even when the object is inanimate. So if you contact the center of a stone, you're aflame with love. Because that's what it is. It's just congealed love, and so are you. And it's the same thing. So when I center upon, John of the Cross says, all things have a center, and his suggestion is that God is the true center of all that exists. The absolute, is at the center of all that exists. I believe this completely, she says. Human beings are not the only ones who have a center whose center is God. So remember, your center is God. Catherine of Genoa said that. Your center is God. You are the Buddha, or you're the Christ. And finally, contacting these centers is actually the prelude to a different way of experiencing God in all things, or the Buddha in all things, or all things as the Buddha, or all things as the body of Christ. If we could put these centers together, we would glimpse the reality of how all emanates from God, form from the absolute, form from the emptiness, and how it can be said God is all things. Everything is the Buddha, everything is Christ. But for now, this is purely a unitive experience, because later the center gives way and explodes to reveal that God is neither center nor circumference. That's a famous statement by a Christian mystic. God is a reality whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. To realize that God is all, and so are you. Which is pretty amazing. But you got to let go of that little frame of reference that's around which you build your little ego in order for that to happen. So, good luck with that.